The grand ballroom of Tokyo Grand Imperial Hotel glittered under crystal chandeliers, filled with laughter, champagne, and power. Billionaires, diplomats, and CEOs gathered for one purpose: to celebrate the launch of Kawamura Global, one of Japan's largest investment firms expanding into Africa. Cameras flashed, and every corner whispered wealth. Among the sea of designer suits and polished accents stood Amara Johnson, a quiet 22-year-old intern from Nigeria, clutching her notepad like a shield. She wasn't supposed to be here, just an assistant to her single mother, who worked as a cleaner for the hotel. But when her mother fell sick that morning, Amara had volunteered to fill in, determined to help. As she moved through the crowd, one of the guests, a tall, smug foreign investor named Richard Vale, noticed her hesitation. His smirk widened as he called out loudly, "Hey, someone get the maid off the floor!" She's lost laughter rippled across the room, and Amara froze, her face burning. But it didn't stop there. Richard, fueled by arrogance and champagne, waved his glass. "Actually," he sneered, "maybe she can translate for us. I'll even give your mom my job if you can understand what we're saying." He turned to a group of Japanese executives and began speaking rapidly, his tone mocking. The room watched, some amused, some uncomfortable. Amara's heart pounded. Her breath trembled, but her eyes didn't waver. For a moment, silence filled the room, until she slowly raised her head. Everyone expected her to walk away. Instead, she opened her mouth and began speaking fluent Japanese. Gasps echoed, glasses froze mid-air. Even Richard's grin collapsed into shock, and in that instant, the entire room realized they had underestimated the wrong girl. The silence that followed Amara's fluent response was heavier than the chandelier above her. The words she spoke, measured, graceful, and perfectly pronounced, rolled through the air like calm thunder. Even the Japanese executives blinked in surprise, exchanging impressed glances. Richard Vale's smirk vanished. He tried to recover, laughing awkwardly. "Well, look at that. The maid's got tricks." But his voice trembled, betraying his unease. Amara bowed slightly, just as she'd been taught back in Kyoto, where she'd spent 3 years studying international relations. Few in the room knew her story. She wasn't just a cleaner's daughter, she was a scholarship student fluent in 3 languages, including Japanese, thanks to a cultural exchange program that had changed her life. Her mother, Angela Johnson, had always told her, "Never let where you come from define how far you go." That belief had carried Amara from a small apartment in Lagos to one of Japan's most prestigious universities. But after graduation, life hadn't been kind. Her mother fell ill, and bills piled up. With no one willing to give a foreign graduate a chance, Amara had returned home to help her mother, taking small translation jobs and assisting her at the hotel to survive. Now, standing in that golden ballroom surrounded by billionaires, Amara felt that same mixture of pride and fear that had followed her all her life. Across the room, Mr. Takeda Kawamura, the aging chairman of Kawamura Global, observed her silently. His sharp eyes missed nothing. He turned slightly to his aide and murmured something in Japanese, a comment that made the aide glance curiously toward Amara. Meanwhile, Richard Vale was determined to reclaim control. "Well," he said loudly, forcing a grin, "if you're so talented, maybe you can clean my office in Japanese too." His companions chuckled weakly, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. Amara didn't answer. She simply stepped aside and continued her work, her expression calm. But inside, a storm brewed, not of anger, but of purpose. That night, after the event ended, she helped pack up decorations and empty glasses, the glamour fading into silence. She didn't expect gratitude, not from people like Richard Vale. But when she turned around, she saw Mr. Kawamura standing there, hands folded neatly behind his back. "You studied at Waseda University," he said in fluent English. his tone respectful. "Did you not?" Amara hesitated. "Yes, sir." "On a scholarship?" He nodded slowly. "You speak Japanese like one of us. And yet, you clean tables." She lowered her eyes. "It's temporary. My mother is unwell. I promised I'd help her until she's better." Mr. Kawamura's gaze softened. "Family before ambition. That is something many here have forgotten." He paused, then added quietly, "Come to my office tomorrow. I may have something for you." Amara blinked, unsure if she'd heard correctly. "Sir?" He smiled faintly. "A translator who can bridge cultures and humility with strength is rare. Don't waste that gift." Then he walked away. That night, Amara lay awake beside her mother's bed, listening to her soft breathing. The city outside shimmered with neon and noise, but inside, she felt still. She replayed the scene in her mind, the laughter, the humiliation, and the sudden silence that followed her words. She didn't just want to prove herself anymore. She wanted to change the way people like Richard Vale saw others. As dawn broke over Tokyo, Amara made a silent promise. She would walk back into that building not as a cleaner, but as a professional. What she didn't know, however, was that Richard Vale wasn't done with her. He had seen the chairman's interest, and jealousy was already taking root. In his world, privilege didn't like being challenged, especially by someone society expected to stay silent. The next day would test not only Amara's intelligence, but her dignity, courage, and sense of justice. Because the moment she entered Kawamura Global's glass tower, everything she thought she knew about fairness, loyalty, and power would be shattered. The glass tower of Kawamura Global shimmered like a blade cutting through the Tokyo skyline. When Amara arrived the next morning, dressed neatly in a modest white blouse and gray skirt, she felt both awe and nervous anticipation. The same building where she had once entered through the service door now welcomed her through its grand marble lobby. At the reception desk, she introduced herself. The assistant blinked in surprise after hearing her name and quickly made a call. Within minutes, a representative from the executive floor escorted her to the top, a place few interns, let alone a hotel cleaner, ever set foot in. Mr. Kawamura was already waiting in his office, a vast space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Tokyo Bay. The sunlight painted his desk in gold. He gestured for her to sit, his demeanor calm but commanding. "I watched you yesterday," he began. "You handled humiliation with grace. That's rare." Amara bowed her head respectfully. "Thank you, sir," he nodded. "I need someone to assist with our African expansion project. It requires cultural understanding, translation, and empathy. I believe you have all three." Amara's breath caught. "You mean a position here?" "On a trial basis," he said. "Let your work speak for you." She accepted immediately. It felt unreal, as if fate had opened a door she hadn't dared to knock on. For the next few days, she immersed herself in research, translation documents, and internal meetings. Her knowledge of Japanese etiquette and her deep understanding of African business ethics made her stand out. Slowly, her presence became noticed, not just by the staff, but by the executives. However, not everyone was pleased. Richard Vale, who had secured his influence in the company through investments and charm, noticed her swift rise. He had expected her to fade into insignificance after their embarrassing encounter. Instead, she was now working directly with the chairman, the same chairman who had been ignoring Vale's latest investment proposal. In his eyes, Amara was not just a girl who had embarrassed him. She was now a threat. Over the following weeks, subtle hostility began to unfold. Documents Amara had translated suddenly went missing from shared folders. Memos were accidentally sent late to her email. She was left out of key meetings, and rumors began circulating, whispers that she was using pity to climb her way up. At first, she tried to ignore it. She focused on her work, telling herself that professionalism would silence jealousy. But the environment grew colder, the stares sharper. One evening, as she packed her things, she overheard two employees near the elevator. "She's the maid from the hotel, right?" one whispered. "Yeah." "I heard Mr. Kawamura only hired her for PR," the other replied. "Makes the company look diverse." Their laughter was quiet, but cutting. Amara's chest tightened, but she walked past them with quiet dignity. She refused to let their words see her bleed. Still, inside, she began to question herself. Was she really strong enough to fight a system built to keep people like her small? Mr. Kawamura, meanwhile, continued to trust her. He saw her determination and moral integrity. When international investors from Lagos and Nairobi arrived for a cultural summit, he asked Amara to lead the translation and communication briefing. It was an enormous opportunity, one that could determine whether the company's expansion succeeded or failed, but Richard saw it as the perfect chance to strike. Behind the scenes, he began plotting. Using his influence over certain staff members, he manipulated files and altered reports Amara had prepared, inserting misleading numbers and mistranslated phrases. His goal was simple: to make her appear incompetent in front of global delegates. The day of the summit arrived. The grand conference room gleamed with flags and floral arrangements. Delegates from Africa and Japan filled their seats, cameras streamed live, and the world watched as Kawamura Global prepared to present its new international partnership. Amara, standing at the podium beside Mr. Kawamura, felt her pulse quicken. The spotlight was blinding, the air heavy with anticipation. When her turn came to present, she began flawlessly, explaining the vision of mutual respect, opportunity, and cultural exchange. Her voice was calm, confident, and full of pride. But halfway through her presentation, a soft murmur rippled through the Japanese side of the table. One executive frowned, whispering to another. Confused, Amara glanced at the projected translation behind her and froze. The words displayed on the screen were not what she had written. The key phrase, "equal trade partnership," had been changed to "charitable support program," completely altering the tone. Shock spread through the room. The African delegates looked insulted. The Japanese executives looked embarrassed. Within seconds, the energy shifted from admiration to tension. Richard, sitting in the back, smirked. Amara's throat tightened. She felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her: suspicion, confusion, judgment. Her body screamed to run, but she steadied herself. She turned toward Mr. Kawamura, who looked at her with quiet concern rather than anger. She knew this was sabotage, but proving it in that moment was impossible. After the meeting ended in uneasy silence, she stayed behind, staring at the empty chairs. The victory she'd imagined had dissolved into humiliation once again. That evening, she went home to her mother's small apartment, tears she hadn't allowed at work finally falling freely. Her mother, still weak from illness, held her hand. "Amara," she whispered softly, "you told me once that language is power. Don't let them twist your words. Show them who you are." Amara listened quietly, her pain turning slowly into resolve. She knew what she had to do, not for revenge, but for truth. The next morning, before dawn, she returned to the office. She accessed the system logs, retracing every version of her translation file. Hours passed, her eyes burning from the screen's glow. Then she found it, the digital fingerprint of the person who had altered the file. Arvale. She stared at the screen, her heart steady, her fear replaced by cold clarity. By the time the company reconvened for the follow-up meeting, Amara was ready. She entered the room with quiet composure, carrying her documents and a USB drive. Mr. Kawamura looked up in surprise. He hadn't expected her to face the board again so soon. When the meeting began, she stood and asked permission to address the executives. The room fell silent. Her voice was calm, but her words carried weight. She explained how mistranslations had caused misunderstanding, then presented the original version, time-stamped and verified. Finally, she displayed the tampered file, revealing the username responsible. Gasps filled the room. All eyes turned toward Richard Vale. His confident posture faltered. "This is a serious accusation," he stammered, his tone brittle. "Anyone could have," but Amara interrupted gently. "The security system records IP addresses, Mr. Vale. The edits were made from your device." "Silence." Mr. Kawamura's gaze hardened. He turned toward Richard, his voice like steel. "You brought shame to this company, boss, and to yourself." The executives murmured in agreement. In that moment, Amara didn't smile or gloat. She simply stood tall, dignity glowing in her silence. She had no need to humiliate anyone. The truth had already done that. But what came next would test her even more deeply. Because Mr. Kawamura, impressed by her courage and integrity, wasn't finished with his decision. "Amara," he said, his tone softening, "this company needs leaders who value honor above ego. I want you to lead our Africa Division's translation and cultural communications team." The room erupted in surprise. Even Amara froze, unsure she'd heard correctly. Richard Vale's face turned pale. But it was real. For the first time in her life, Amara felt seen. Not for her background, not for her accent, but for her strength. Still, she knew that acceptance in the corporate world came at a price, and the road ahead would demand more courage than she'd ever known. Because outside that boardroom, whispers would start again. Jealousy would return, and the shadow of racism, silent, invisible, but ever-present, would continue to test her humanity. But this time, she wouldn't bend. This time, she had found her voice, and the world was finally listening. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change. News of Amara's promotion spread throughout the company, stirring both admiration and resentment. Employees whispered her name in hallways, some in respect, others in bitterness. Her rise, though well-earned, had exposed the fragile egos of those who believed power belonged only to a certain kind of person. But Amara didn't let it distract her. She poured her energy into rebuilding trust between Kawamura Global and their African partners. Her vision was simple: business built on equality, not charity. She created new translation standards, rewrote communication protocols, and even proposed cultural training sessions to teach executives about Africa's business etiquette. Slowly, she began to heal the wounds caused by Richard's sabotage. Mr. Kawamura watched her progress with pride. "You remind me," he told her once, "that respect is the only true language humans share." Still, beneath the calm surface, tension brewed. Richard Vale had not accepted defeat. Publicly, he apologized and withdrew from the project, but privately, his resentment grew darker. He had lost face, influence, and the chairman's favor, all to the woman he once mocked. Late one evening, as Tokyo's lights shimmered across the bay, Amara stayed behind to finalize a report for the upcoming investor summit. The office was quiet. Too quiet. She didn't notice Richard enter until his reflection appeared in the glass wall beside her. "Working late, are we?" His tone was smooth but cold. Amara didn't look up. "Yes, preparing for the board presentation." He stepped closer, his polished shoes echoing on the marble floor. "You think this little fairy tale will last? You embarrassed powerful people, Amara. People don't forget that her hands paused over the keyboard, but her voice remained calm. Truth doesn't embarrass people. Lies do." Richard chuckled, low and bitter. "You really think you belong here? You're a charity case that got lucky." She finally turned to face him, her gaze steady. "If I'm lucky, it's because I worked for it." For a moment, the air thickened between them. Then his smirk vanished, replaced by something colder. "You'll regret crossing me." He turned and left, his footsteps fading into silence. Amara stood still, her heartbeat steady. For years she had run from humiliation, from being underestimated, from the quiet sting of prejudice. But now she felt no fear. She had earned her place, and she would not surrender it to hate. 2 days later, the Investor Summit began. It was the company's most important event of the year, streamed to millions worldwide. The conference hall was a sea of cameras, flags, and anticipation. Amara stood backstage, her heart calm but resolute. She had spent nights preparing, not just numbers and graphs, but words that carried meaning. Words that would remind every listener that dignity wasn't granted by status. It was a right every human shared. When she stepped onto the stage beside Mr. Kawamura, the crowd fell silent. She began her presentation in Japanese, then seamlessly transitioned into English and Swahili, translating her own words, bridging continents in real time. Her voice carried conviction and compassion. As she spoke, the audience leaned in, captivated. The message was simple yet profound. Language should never be a barrier to respect. We misunderstand one another not because of words, but because of pride. The room erupted into applause. In the back, Richard watched, his expression unreadable. The spotlight that once favored him now illuminated the woman he had tried to silence. When the presentation ended, investors stood to shake Amara's hand. Journalists surrounded her, calling her the voice of connection. Mr. Kawamura smiled proudly beside her. But it wasn't until she stepped outside, feeling the crisp Tokyo air, that the full weight of her journey hit her. She remembered the hotel ballroom, the laughter, the insult, the moment she had found her courage. That was where it all began. And now, standing beneath the same city lights that once made her feel small, she realized she had transformed pain into power. For the first time in her life, she wasn't reacting to prejudice. She was rising above it. And though the world's eyes were finally on her, Amara knew that her true victory wasn't fame or promotion or recognition. It was the quiet strength to stay kind, to stay human, in a world that had tried to strip that away. Weeks after the summit, the world was still talking about Amara Johnson. Her speech had gone viral, translated into multiple languages, shared across business networks, and quoted in newspapers as a defining statement about equality in global trade. Inside Kawamura Global, the atmosphere shifted. Her initiatives led to stronger partnerships across Africa, inspiring other companies to adopt similar approaches. For the first time, Japanese and African executives began working side by side, united by genuine respect rather than transactional formality. But for Amara, the most meaningful moment wasn't found in headlines or meetings. It came quietly one evening as she walked through the hotel lobby where it all began. Her mother was sitting in her cleaning uniform, resting after a long day. When she saw Amara, she smiled faintly, pride shining in her tired eyes. "You did it," she said softly. "You turned their laughter into applause." Amara knelt beside her. "No, Mama." "We did. You taught me to never bow to shame, only to wisdom." For a while, they sat in silence, watching the city lights flicker through the glass doors. The same city that once mocked them now bowed in recognition. Elsewhere, Richard Vail had quietly resigned. His name had faded from business magazines and conversations, not through scandal, but through irrelevance. Those who built careers on ego rarely survived in worlds rebuilt on truth. Amara didn't hate him. She didn't need to. His downfall was not her triumph. Her growth was. She continued to work at Kawamura Global, eventually leading the company's cross-cultural division. Under her guidance, dozens of young translators, interns, and dreamers, many from underrepresented backgrounds, found opportunities that once seemed impossible. She made sure the company's doors stayed open for people like her, those who were often judged by their accent, their color, or their silence. In every training session she led, she reminded her team, never mistake politeness for weakness. Never confuse humility with submission. The world respects confidence, but it changes for compassion. And as the years passed, that belief became the company's unofficial philosophy. One evening, as she stood by her office window watching the Tokyo skyline glow, she thought back to that single cruel sentence. Translate this, I'll give your mom my job. It had been meant to humiliate her. Instead, it became the fire that forged her destiny. She smiled, not in pride, but in peace, because she had learned something profound. When someone tries to use words to belittle you, you can either let them wound you, or you can turn them into your weapon of wisdom. Her journey had taught her that dignity wasn't earned from validation. It was reclaimed from adversity. And though the world often measured success in money and titles, Amara's true victory was something far greater. She had proved that humanity, respect, and intelligence could outshine prejudice in any language. As the camera of fate pulled back, over the glittering city, the calm bay, and the woman who had rewritten her story, one truth echoed like a quiet storm. You can silence a voice, but not its message. And somewhere in the silence, it felt as if every person who had ever been looked down upon, underestimated or mocked, stood a little taller, spoke a little louder, and believed a little more in their own worth. If Amara's story inspired you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that dignity speaks louder than prejudice.